Homeless veteran saves a CEO's life. What the CEO does next will make you cry. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the narrow alley behind the Grand Central Market in downtown Los Angeles. Alexander Hayes pressed his back against the cold brick wall, his $8,000 Italian suit now torn and stained. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it over the distant traffic noise. "Please, just take the wallet," Alexander whispered, raising his hand slowly. The Rolex Daytona on his wrist caught the dim streetlight, a mistake that made the three men surrounding him smile with predatory hunger. The leader, a tall man with a spider tattoo crawling up his neck, stepped closer. "Oh, we're taking much more than your wallet, rich boy." The metallic click of a switchblade opening made Alexander's blood freeze. This wasn't supposed to happen, not to him. Not to Alexander Hayes, CEO of Nexus Technologies, the man who had revolutionized artificial intelligence and was worth $3.2 billion. He lived in a $20 million mansion in Pacific Heights, San Francisco, where the biggest danger was choosing between his McLaren or his Lamborghini for the morning drive. But here he was, 43 years old, about to die in a filthy alley that reeked of garbage and broken dreams. "You know what I hate most about people like you?" The man with the tattoo pressed the blade against Alexander's throat. "You walk around like you own the world, like the rest of us are invisible." Alexander felt the cold steel against his skin. In this moment, all his success, all his money, all his power, none of it mattered. He was just another victim. "I have a family," Alexander managed to say, thinking of his daughter Emma, only 12 years old. "Please." "Should have thought about that before." The sound came from nowhere, a violent crash, like thunder exploding in a confined space. The man with the knife suddenly flew sideways, his body slamming into the alley wall with a sickening thud. Alexander blinked, trying to process what had just happened. Where the attacker had been standing, now there was a different man, older, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks, with graying hair and a beard that had seen better days. But his eyes were sharp, alert, dangerous. "You boys picked the wrong night," the stranger said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone who had seen real violence. "Walk away now, and nobody else gets hurt." The two remaining attackers looked at their unconscious friend, then at this homeless man who had appeared from the shadows like some urban guardian angel. "This ain't your business, old man," one of them snarled, pulling out a gun. That's when Alexander saw something that would stay with him forever. The homeless man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, not a happy smile, but the smile of someone who had danced with death so many times that bullets had become old friends. "Son," the man said, taking a step forward, "I've been shot at by Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan. Your little pop gun doesn't scare me." What happened next was like watching a master at work. The homeless man moved with precision that defied his appearance. Years of military training exploded into action. In 15 seconds, both attackers were on the ground, and the gun was in the veteran's hand. "Run," he said simply, and the three men scrambled away into the Los Angeles night, dragging their unconscious friend between them. Alexander stood there, shaking, unable to speak. This man, this homeless veteran who society had forgotten, had just saved his life. "You okay?" the man asked, extending his hand. Alexander noticed the faded tattoo on his forearm, 101st Airborne. Yes. "I think so," Alexander stammered, still in shock. Who are you?" The man smiled, a real smile this time. "James Crawford. Friends call me Jimmy." He looked Alexander up and down, taking in the expensive suit and the obvious wealth. "And you're definitely not from around here." "Alexander Hayes," he replied, finally finding his voice. "I can't thank you enough. You saved my life." Jimmy shrugged like it was nothing. Right place, right time. But as Alexander looked into this man's eyes, He saw something that made his chest tighten. Pain. Deep, old pain that money couldn't fix and success couldn't heal. The same pain he had seen in the mirror every morning for the past 8 years, ever since his brother David had died in Afghanistan. "Let me do something for you," Alexander said. "Money? A job? Anything?" "I don't need your charity," Jimmy cut him off, but not unkindly. "Just glad you're okay?" Jimmy started to walk away, disappearing back into the shadows where he had come from. But fate wasn't done with either of them yet. As he took his third step, Jimmy suddenly stopped, his hand going to his chest. I don't feel—" He collapsed. Alexander rushed to his side and saw the blood. During the fight, one of the attackers had managed to stab Jimmy. The veteran had been bleeding this entire time, but hadn't said a word. "Help!" Alexander screamed into the empty alley. "Somebody help us!" As he held Jimmy's head in his lap, watching this stranger's blood stain his expensive suit, Alexander Hayes had no idea that this moment would change everything, that this homeless veteran carried secrets that would shatter his world and rebuild it in ways he never imagined possible. The sound of approaching sirens filled the night air, but Alexander barely heard them. All he could think about was the man who had given everything to save a complete stranger, a man whose story was about to become forever intertwined with his own. Biopo. The fluorescent lights of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center buzzed overhead as Alexander paced the emergency room waiting area. His blood-stained Armani suit drew curious stares from other patients, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, his appearance was the last thing on his mind. "Sir, are you family?" The nurse behind the desk looked at him with tired eyes. It was 2:47 a.m., and the ER was still bustling with the usual Friday night chaos of Los Angeles. "No, he saved my life," Alexander said, realizing how inadequate those words sounded. "James Crawford. The paramedics brought him in about an hour ago." The nurse's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry, but without being family, I can't give you information about his condition." Alexander felt a surge of frustration. In his world, money and influence opened every door. Hospital administrators took his calls. Doctors made house visits to his Pacific Heights mansion. But here, in this sterile waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and human suffering, none of that mattered. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "This man doesn't have family. He's homeless. If I don't ask about him, who will?" The nurse studied his face for a long moment. Something in his desperation must have convinced her, because she glanced around and then leaned closer. "He's in surgery. Knife wound punctured his lung. The doctors are optimistic, but—" She paused. "Sir, he doesn't have insurance. The hospital will do what they can, but—" "Money isn't an issue," Alexander said immediately. "Whatever it costs, I'll cover everything." The nurse blinked in surprise. "Everything, Mr. Hayes, this could be—" "I said everything." Alexander pulled out his black American Express card, the one with no spending limit. "Get me whoever I need to talk to." 20 minutes later, Alexander found himself in the office of Dr. Patricia Morales, the head of emergency surgery. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and hands that had clearly saved countless lives. "Mr. Crawford is lucky to be alive," she said, reviewing the chart. The knife missed his heart by inches, but it punctured his left lung and caused significant internal bleeding. "We've repaired the damage, but he'll need extensive recovery time." "Whatever he needs," Alexander said. "Private room, best care available." Dr. Morales looked at him curiously. "You're not family?" "He doesn't have family," Alexander replied. "At least, none that we know of." "I see." She made a note in the file. "Mr. Hayes, may I ask why you're doing this? It's not common for strangers to—" "He took a knife meant for me," Alexander interrupted. 3 men were going to kill me tonight, and this man, this complete stranger, stepped in without hesitation. He knew he might die, and he did it anyway." Dr. Morales nodded slowly. "We see a lot of veterans come through here, Mr. Hayes. Many of them are forgotten by the system they served. It's refreshing to see someone who remembers their sacrifice. As Alexander signed the paperwork guaranteeing payment for Jimmy's care, he found himself thinking about his brother David. David had been so passionate about serving his country, about making a difference. He'd enlisted right after college, despite their parents' protests. "The strong protect the weak, Alex," David had said, before deploying to Afghanistan. "That's what separates us from animals." Now, 8 years after David's death, a stranger had lived by those same words to save Alexander's life. "Can I see him?" Alexander asked. "He's still unconscious from the surgery, but you can sit with him for a few minutes." Room 314 was quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Jimmy lay connected to various machines, his weathered face peaceful in sleep. Without the grime of the streets, Alexander could see that the man was probably in his late 40s or early 50s, with the kind of strong jawline that spoke of determination. Alexander pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. In his pocket, his phone buzzed constantly. Probably his assistant, wondering why he'd missed his red-eye flight back to San Francisco. But for once, the business empire that had consumed his life seemed insignificant. "I don't even know your story," Alexander said quietly to the unconscious man. "But somehow I feel like I owe you more than just medical bills." As if responding to his voice, Jimmy stirred slightly. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. Where am I?" Jimmy's voice was hoarse. "Cedars-Sinai Hospital," Alexander said, leaning forward. "You've been in surgery. How do you feel?" Jimmy tried to sit up, but winced from the pain. "The guys who attacked you, gone." "You scared them off." Alexander gently pressed Jimmy back down. "You need to rest." "Hospital?" Jimmy's eyes showed panic. "I can't afford—" "It's taken care of," Alexander said firmly. "Don't worry about money." Jimmy studied Alexander's face with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through him. "You don't know me? Why would you—" "Because 8 years ago I lost my brother in Afghanistan," Alexander said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "He was a soldier, like you. He believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Tonight, you reminded me of everything I'd forgotten about honor and sacrifice." Something shifted in Jimmy's expression. "Afghanistan?" "David Hayes, Army Ranger. He died in 2016. Jimmy's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "David Hayes?" Alexander's heart stopped. "You knew my brother?" But before Jimmy could answer, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted back into unconsciousness, leaving Alexander with 1,000 questions and the unsettling feeling that this encounter was more than just random chance. Outside Jimmy's room, Alexander made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He called his assistant. "Sarah, cancel all my meetings for the next week." "Yes, all of them." "And I need you to do some research on a James Crawford military veteran, probably served in Afghanistan around 2016. As Alexander hung up the phone, he looked back through the window at the man sleeping in the hospital bed. Whatever connection existed between Jimmy and his brother David, Alexander was going to find out, even if the truth destroyed everything he thought he knew about how his brother died. Feierlich, Traut. 3 days passed before Jimmy was stable enough to have visitors again. During that time, Alexander found himself returning to the hospital every evening after work, flying back and forth between San Francisco and Los Angeles like a man possessed. His board of directors thought he'd lost his mind. "Alex, you're missing the quarterly review with Goldman Sachs for a homeless man you barely know," his CFO had said during a tense video call. "This isn't like you." But Alexander couldn't explain the pull he felt. Every time he tried to focus on spreadsheets and profit margins, he saw Jimmy's eyes in that alley, the eyes of a man who had looked death in the face and chosen to fight anyway. On Wednesday evening, as Alexander sat in Jimmy's room reading emails on his phone, a young nurse named Maria approached him. "Mr. Hayes, we need to move Mr. Crawford's belongings from the emergency storage." "Since you're his emergency contact now, Could you take a look and see if there's anything valuable we should secure?" Alexander looked up, surprised. "I'm his emergency contact. You signed the paperwork, remember? And you're paying for his care, so legally." Maria shrugged. "It's just a few personal items. Nothing much, I'm afraid." She led him to a small storage room where Jimmy's possessions sat in a clear plastic bag. Alexander's heart sank at how little there was. A worn leather wallet with .347 inside, a faded photo of a young woman with kind eyes, a military challenge coin, and an old canvas messenger bag that looked like it had survived a war. "That's everything?" Alexander asked. "That's everything," Maria confirmed. "Pretty sad, isn't it? A whole life reduced to what fits in a hospital bag." After Maria left, Alexander found himself alone with the belongings of a man who had saved his life. He felt like an intruder, but something compelled him to look closer. Maybe there was family to contact, someone who should know Jimmy was alive. The wallet contained no credit cards, no driver's license, just a military ID that was 8 years out of date, and the photo of the woman. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Love always, Elizabeth. Wait for me." Alexander's chest tightened. Jimmy had someone once, someone who loved him enough to wait. Where was she now? The challenge coin was from the 101st Airborne, just like the tattoo Alexander had seen on Jimmy's arm. As Alexander turned it over in his hands, he noticed something etched on the back. D.H. Brothers in Arms, 2016. D.H. David Hayes. Alexander's hands began to shake. This couldn't be a coincidence. Jimmy had a challenge coin with his brother's initials from the exact year David died. With trembling fingers, Alexander opened the canvas messenger bag. Inside, wrapped in an old T-shirt, were more military documents, a Bronze Star medal, and at the bottom a sealed envelope that made Alexander's world stop spinning. The envelope was addressed in David's handwriting Alexander would recognize anywhere because he'd stared at David's last letter home 1,000 times. But this envelope wasn't addressed to Alexander or their parents. It was addressed to Sergeant James Crawford, 101st Airborne Division. The letter had never been opened. Alexander stared at the envelope, his mind racing. His brother had written a letter to Jimmy Crawford, the same Jimmy Crawford who was now lying unconscious 3 floors above him, the same man who had saved his life in a Los Angeles alley. What were the odds? In a city of 4 million people, in a country of 330 million, Alexander had been saved by someone who knew his brother, someone David had cared enough about to write a letter to. Alexander's hand shook as he held the envelope up to the light. He could see there was more than one page inside, and something else. Maybe a photograph. He shouldn't open it. It wasn't his letter. It was Jimmy's, and Jimmy was alive to read it himself. But Alexander had been living with questions about David's death for 8 years. The official report said David died in a Taliban attack while protecting Afghan civilians, but it had always felt incomplete. There were details that didn't make sense, gaps in the timeline that the Army couldn't or wouldn't explain. Maybe this letter held answers. Alexander looked around the empty storage room, then at the envelope again. If he opened it now, he could reseal it before Jimmy woke up. The man would never know. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Alexander knew he couldn't do it. David had written this letter to Jimmy, not to him. Whatever secrets it contained, Jimmy deserved to read them first. Alexander carefully placed the letter back in the bag, but as he did, he noticed something else. Tucked behind the Bronze Star medal was a small military photograph. A group of soldiers in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling despite the harsh landscape behind them. In the center of the photo, Alexander immediately recognized his brother David's face. But standing right next to him, younger and clean-shaven, but unmistakably the same man, was Jimmy Crawford. Alexander sank into a nearby chair, the photograph trembling in his hands. Jimmy hadn't just known David, they had served together. They had been close enough to stand side by side in what was clearly a unit photo. And somehow, 8 years later, the universe had brought Jimmy Crawford into Alexander's life at the exact moment he needed saving. "Mr. Hayes," Maria's voice came from the doorway, "is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Alexander looked up at her, then back at the photograph of his brother and the man upstairs who had saved his life. "Maybe I have," he whispered. As Alexander carefully repacked Jimmy's belongings, his mind raced with questions. How well had Jimmy known David? Were they friends? Why had David written him a letter? And most importantly, what really happened the day his brother died? Alexander had built an empire by asking the right questions and finding the right answers. But as he carried Jimmy's possessions back to the elevator, he realized that some answers might be too painful to bear. Still, he had to know. David's letter to Jimmy might hold the key to understanding his brother's final days, and Alexander wouldn't rest until he knew the truth, even if that truth changed everything. Jimmy's eyes opened slowly on Thursday morning, clearer and more focused than they had been since the surgery. Alexander was already there, sitting in the chair beside the bed, the canvas messenger bag at his feet. "You're here early," Jimmy said, his voice still rough but stronger. "Don't you have a company to run?" "Companies can wait," Alexander replied. "We need to talk." Something in Alexander's tone made Jimmy's expression grow cautious. Years of military training had taught him to read people, and right now, the man who had saved his life looked like he was carrying the weight of the world. "About what?" Alexander reached down and pulled out the military photograph, placing it on the bedside table where Jimmy could see it. Jimmy's reaction was immediate and devastating. His face went pale, and his hands began to shake. "Where did you get this?" Jimmy whispered. "It was in your bag, along with this." Alexander held up David's letter, still sealed. "My brother wrote you a letter, Jimmy. A letter you never opened." Jimmy closed his eyes tightly, as if he could make the photograph disappear. "You shouldn't have gone through my things." "The hospital needed to secure your belongings. I'm your emergency contact, remember?" Alexander leaned forward. "Jimmy? What aren't you telling me? How well did you know David?" For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the steady beeping of monitors. When Jimmy finally opened his eyes, they were filled with a pain so deep that Alexander felt it in his own chest. "David Hayes was my best friend," Jimmy said quietly. "For 18 months in Afghanistan, we were inseparable. He saved my life more times than I can count, and Jimmy's voice broke. "I was supposed to save his." Alexander felt the air leave his lungs. "You were there when he died?" Jimmy nodded, tears now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "I was his squad leader, March 15th, 2016. We were on a patrol near Kandahar when we got intel about Taliban fighters holding a group of Afghan civilians hostage in a village compound." Alexander leaned closer. This was more detail about David's final mission than the Army had ever provided to his family. "Command wanted to wait for air support," Jimmy continued. "But, David, your brother had this thing about innocent people getting hurt. He couldn't stand by and do nothing when people were suffering." That sounds like David," Alexander said softly, remembering his brother's fierce sense of justice. "The civilians were families, women, children, elderly people. The Taliban was using them as human shields while they set up an ambush for a supply convoy that was coming through the next morning." Jimmy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "David convinced me we couldn't wait. He said those families had already been through enough." Jimmy paused, staring at the ceiling, as if he could see that day playing out above him. "I made the call to split our unit. Standard tactical move. I took half the squad to create a distraction while David led the other half to extract the civilians from the back of the compound." Jimmy's voice became barely a whisper. "It should have worked. I've run that scenario 100 times in my head, and it should have worked." "What went wrong?" Alexander asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The Taliban had more fighters than our intel suggested, and they were better equipped. Jimmy looked directly at Alexander, his eyes filled with 8 years of guilt. When David's team reached the civilians, it was a trap. The Taliban had been torturing them to force our hand. Alexander's hands clenched into fists. The Army never told us any of this. They couldn't. It would have compromised ongoing operations in the region. Jimmy took a shaky breath. David could have retreated when he realized it was a trap. Any reasonable soldier would have called for backup and pulled back. But your brother, he looked at those families, at a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and he made a choice? What choice? He ordered his men to cover the civilians' escape while he held off the Taliban fighters alone. Jimmy's voice cracked completely. By the time my half of the squad fought through to support him, it was too late. David had taken multiple shots but kept fighting until every single civilian was safe. Alexander felt tears streaming down his own face now. This was his brother, the same David who had given his lunch money to hungry kids at school, who had worked summers at a homeless shelter, who had enlisted because he believed the strong should protect the weak. I found him leaning against a wall, Alex, Jimmy continued. He was bleeding out, but he was smiling. You know what his last words were? Alexander shook his head, unable to speak. He said, Jimmy, promise me you'll tell my family I went out doing what I loved, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Jimmy sobbed openly now. And then he said, take care of my little brother. Make sure Alex knows he doesn't have to carry the weight of the world alone anymore. Ah, yes. The room fell silent except for the sound of 2 grown men crying, one for a brother he'd lost, one for a friend he'd failed to save. The letter, Alexander managed to say. Why didn't you ever open David's letter? Jimmy looked at the sealed envelope like it was a weapon pointed at his heart. Because I broke my promise to him. I was supposed to find you, supposed to tell you how your brother really died. But when I got home... Jimmy gestured to his hospital gown, his homeless state. PTSD, survivor's guilt, nightmares every night. I couldn't even take care of myself, let alone honor David's last request. Jimmy, I became a coward, Alex. I lost my house, my fiancée Elizabeth, my job. Everything. I've been living on the streets for 6 years because I couldn't face the world knowing I'd failed the best man I ever knew. Jimmy looked directly at Alexander. How could I tell David's family about his heroism when I couldn't even manage to be half the man he was? Alexander stood up and moved closer to the bed. You saved my life 3 nights ago. That's different. No, it's not. Alexander's voice was firm. You saw 3 armed men attacking a stranger, and without hesitation, you put yourself in harm's way to protect someone who couldn't protect himself. That's exactly what David would have done. Jimmy stared at Alexander as if seeing him for the first time. David didn't fail you, Jimmy, and you didn't fail David. Alexander picked up the sealed letter. Maybe it's time we both stopped carrying guilt that isn't ours to bear. As Alexander placed the letter in Jimmy's trembling hands, both men realized that this moment, this connection forged in a Los Angeles alley and cemented in a hospital room, was bigger than either of them. It was David Hayes reaching across 8 years of silence to bring together 2 people who needed each other more than they knew. The truth about David's death was finally coming to light. But neither man was prepared for what that letter would reveal about the depth of friendship, sacrifice, and the promises that bind soldiers together, even beyond death. Jimmy held David's letter in his hands for nearly 10 minutes without moving. Alexander watched as emotions played across the veteran's face: fear, guilt, longing, and something that looked like hope. 8 years, Jimmy finally whispered. For 8 years, I've carried this letter like a weight around my neck. I was terrified to open it because what if David blamed me for what happened? There's only one way to find out, Alexander said gently. With shaking fingers, Jimmy carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 3 handwritten pages and a small photograph that fluttered to the bed. Alexander recognized the photo immediately. It was a picture of their family from David's last Christmas home. David, Alexander, and their parents standing in front of their Christmas tree in Pacific Heights. Jimmy unfolded the letter, and Alexander could see David's familiar handwriting covering every inch of the pages. Jimmy's eyes moved across the first few lines, and his expression immediately changed. "What does it say?" Alexander asked. Jimmy looked up, tears already forming. He wrote this the night before the mission where he died." Jimmy's voice was barely audible. "Alex, your brother knew he might not come back." "Read it to me," Alexander said, "please." Jimmy cleared his throat and began to read David's words aloud. "Jimmy, if you're reading this, then something went wrong with tomorrow's mission, and I didn't make it home. I'm writing this because there are things you need to know, things I could never say to your face, because you'd try to stop me from doing what I have to do." Jimmy paused, his hands trembling. Alexander motioned for him to continue. "First, I want you to know that everything that happens tomorrow is my choice. Not yours, not the Army's, not anyone else's. Mine. I've been in contact with an Afghan interpreter named Rashid who has been feeding us intel on Taliban movements. Today he told me something that Command doesn't know yet." "Command doesn't know?" Alexander interrupted. "What did David learn?" Jimmy continued reading. "The Taliban isn't just holding random civilians in that compound. They're holding Rashid's family, his wife Amara, his 3 children, and his elderly parents. Rashid has been risking his life for 2 years helping American forces, and now his family is going to die because of his loyalty to us." Alexander felt his stomach drop. "David went on an unauthorized mission? Jimmy, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I should follow protocol, wait for orders, let Command handle it. But by the time we go through proper channels, Rashid's family will be dead. The Taliban is planning to execute them at dawn as an example to other Afghan allies." The room fell silent. Alexander was beginning to understand that his brother's final mission was far more complex than the official report had indicated. "Here's what I need you to understand, Jimmy. I'm not going to ask you or the squad to join me in this. I'm going to volunteer for tomorrow's patrol, and I'm going to accidentally deviate from the mission parameters to save those people. If something happens to me, I need you to make sure the Army doesn't blame anyone else for my decision." "Jesus," Alexander whispered. "David planned his own mission." Jimmy's voice cracked as he continued. "The second thing I need you to know is that you've been the best friend I've ever had. You've saved my life 6 times in the past 18 months. Yes, I've been keeping count. And you've never asked for anything in return except my friendship. If I don't make it home, the fault is mine, not yours. You are the bravest, most honorable man I know, and I'm proud to serve beside you." Jimmy had to stop reading. He was crying too hard to see the words clearly. "What else?" Alexander pressed gently. "Jimmy, there's something I've never told you about my family. My brother Alexander is brilliant, successful, and completely lost. Since our father died 3 years ago, Alex has been carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. He built a billion-dollar company, trying to prove he was worthy of the Hayes name, but he's drowning in loneliness." Alexander felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. David had seen right through him, even from 8,000 miles away. "If something happens to me, I need you to find Alex, not to deliver some heroic speech about how I died. He won't need that. Find him because he needs a friend who understands what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. He needs someone who won't be impressed by his money or his success, someone who will see him as just a man who's trying to do right by the world." Jimmy looked up at Alexander. "He wrote this 2 years before you built Nexus Technologies. How could he have known you'd become so successful?" "Because David always saw potential in people before they saw it in themselves," Alexander said softly. "What else does the letter say?" "The last thing, Jimmy, is the hardest thing I've ever had to write. The Army is going to classify tomorrow's mission, and they're going to change the official story. They have to. If the truth came out about unauthorized rescues of Afghan interpreters' families, it would compromise ongoing operations and put other allies at risk. Alexander leaned forward. The Army knew they were going to lie about what happened. They're going to say I died in a routine patrol ambush while protecting civilians. It's not entirely false. I will be protecting civilians. But they'll leave out the part about me going off mission to save Rashid's family. They'll make it sound like random heroism instead of deliberate choice. Jimmy's hands were shaking as he read the final paragraph. Jimmy, promise me 3 things. First, don't let my family blame themselves for my death. Second, don't you blame yourself either. This is my choice, made with full knowledge of the consequences. And third, find my brother Alexander. Tell him that his big brother's last act was exactly what he would have wanted it to be, saving innocent people who had no one else to fight for them. Tell him that he doesn't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. Your brother always, David Hayes. P.S. I left something for Alex in my footlocker. Make sure he gets it. The room fell completely silent. Alexander stared at Jimmy, then at the letter, trying to process what he'd just heard. The Army lied to us, Alexander said finally. For 8 years they let us believe David died in a random attack, but he chose to save those people. He planned it. Alex, Jimmy said quietly, there's more you need to know. The mission, it worked. Rashid's family survived. All of them. David died, but those 6 people, including 3 children, are alive today because of what your brother did. Alexander felt something breaking open in his chest. For 8 years, he'd carried the image of David dying in some meaningless skirmish. But the truth was so much more than that. David had died exactly as he had lived, choosing to protect the innocent, regardless of the cost to himself. And you've been carrying this secret alone for 8 years, Alexander said, looking at Jimmy with new understanding. I tried to find you, Alex. For the first year after I got home, I tried, but every time I got close to contacting your family, I'd have a panic attack. How do you tell someone that their son died because he chose to be a hero? How do you explain that the Army had to lie about it to protect other operations? Alexander stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling city of Los Angeles. Somewhere out there, people were going about their daily lives, unaware that in this hospital room, 2 men were finally understanding the true meaning of sacrifice and friendship. Jimmy, Alexander said, turning back to face him, what was in David's footlocker? What did he leave for me? Jimmy wiped his eyes and smiled for the first time since reading the letter. A Bronze Star medal and a note that said, for Alex, this medal represents courage under fire. You show that same courage every day in your own battles. Love, David. Alexander felt tears streaming down his face again. David had seen something in him that he'd never seen in himself. The Army never gave us any medal, Alexander said, because officially David died in a routine patrol. Bronze Stars aren't awarded for routine patrols. Jimmy looked directly at Alexander, but his commanding officer made sure I got David's personal Bronze Star to give to his family. I've been carrying it for 8 years, waiting for the courage to fulfill David's last request. As the weight of 8 years of secrets settled between them, both men realized that this moment was bigger than grief, bigger than guilt, bigger than the circumstances that had brought them together. David Hayes had orchestrated this meeting from beyond the grave, bringing together 2 broken men who needed each other to heal. But the hardest revelations were yet to come. Alexander sat back down, processing everything he'd just learned. But as he watched Jimmy carefully fold David's letter, he could see that the veteran was still carrying a burden that even David's words hadn't lifted. Jimmy, David's letter makes it clear that what happened was his choice. So why do I still see guilt in your eyes? Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because the letter doesn't tell the whole story, Alex. David may have planned to go off mission to save Rashid's family, but he couldn't have done it alone. Jimmy looked up, his eyes filled with fresh pain. I was the squad leader. When David told me about Rashid's intel the night before the mission, I had a choice to make. What choice? I could have stopped him. I could have ordered him to follow protocol, wait for command approval, stick to the official mission parameters. Jimmy's hands clenched into fists. But I looked at my best friend, and I saw the same expression he had when he talked about you and your family, pure determination to protect people he cared about. Alexander leaned forward. So you helped him? I made the decision to split our 12-man squad during the official patrol. 6 men with me to create a distraction, 6 men with David to extract the civilians. Jimmy's voice cracked. It was a tactical decision that I made as squad leader. David didn't go rogue. I authorized a deviation from the mission plan. The weight of this revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. You're saying you sent David to his death? I'm saying I gave my best friend permission to be a hero, knowing it might kill him. Tears streamed down Jimmy's face. For 8 years, I've replayed that moment. 6 and 6, Alex. I could have split it differently. 8 men with David, 4 with me. Or I could have refused the deviation entirely. But I looked at David's face when he told me about those children, and I... Jimmy broke off, unable to continue. And you, what? Alexander pressed gently. And I remembered why I became a soldier in the first place. To protect innocent people. Jimmy wiped his eyes. But there's something else, Alex. Something that makes my guilt even worse. Alexander wasn't sure he could handle any more revelations, but he nodded for Jimmy to continue. 3 months before the mission that killed David, we were in a similar situation. Taliban fighters had taken control of a school in a village outside Kabul. 26 children and 4 teachers were being held hostage. What happened? Command wanted to wait for special forces, but David and I could see the building was rigged with explosives. The Taliban was planning to blow up the school with everyone inside if their demands weren't met. Jimmy's voice grew stronger as he told the story. I made the same decision, split the squad. I took half to create a distraction, while David led the other half to extract the hostages. Alexander could see where this was going, and his chest tightened. During the extraction, David took a Taliban sniper's bullet meant for one of the children. He went down hard, Alex. For 30 seconds I thought I'd lost him. Jimmy looked directly at Alexander, but I managed to get to him in time. I dragged David to safety while the rest of our squad finished the evacuation. You saved David's life, Alexander said quietly. That's what haunts me most. I saved David once, Alex. I proved that my tactical decisions could work, that splitting the squad was viable if executed properly. Jimmy's voice became filled with self-recrimination. So when David came to me 3 months later with Rashid's intel, I thought I could do it again. I thought I was good enough, smart enough, fast enough to save my friend twice. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. Alexander was beginning to understand the true depth of Jimmy's guilt. You blame yourself because the second mission didn't work the way the first one did, Alexander said. I was arrogant, Alex. After saving David once, I thought I was invincible. I thought my tactics were foolproof. Jimmy laughed bitterly. But the second mission had more variables, more Taliban fighters, better equipment, a more complex compound layout. I should have insisted on waiting for backup, but I let my ego and my previous success cloud my judgment. Alexander stood up and began pacing the small hospital room. Jimmy, you saved a school full of children 3 months before David died. You and David together saved Rashid's family. You've spent your life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Why are you focusing on the one time things went wrong instead of all the times things went right? Because David Hayes was the best man I ever knew, and he's dead because I wasn't good enough to save him twice, Jimmy said simply. Alexander stopped pacing and looked at Jimmy with sudden clarity. You know what I think? I think David knew exactly what he was asking of you when he came to you with Rashid's intel. He knew the risks, he knew the odds, and he trusted you to make the right tactical decision. But I made the wrong decision. No. Alexander's voice was firm. You made the same decision that had worked 3 months earlier. You made the decision that any reasonable squad leader would make with the intelligence you had available. The fact that it didn't work doesn't make it wrong. Jimmy stared at Alexander as if he'd never considered this perspective. David's letter says it was his choice, Jimmy. Not yours, his choice. Alexander sat back down beside the bed. And you know what else? That night in the alley, when you saved my life, you made the same choice David made. You saw someone in danger, and without hesitation, you put yourself at risk to protect them. That's different. It's exactly the same. 3 men with weapons, 1 unarmed victim, impossible odds. Sound familiar? Alexander leaned closer. Jimmy, you didn't fail David. You honored him. Every single day for 8 years, you've been carrying his values even when you thought you'd lost everything else. For the first time since Alexander had met him, Jimmy Crawford looked like he might actually believe that forgiveness was possible. There's something else in David's letter that we need to talk about, Alexander said softly. He asked you to find me, not to deliver a message about his death, but because he thought I needed a friend who understood sacrifice. Jimmy looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, maybe this whole thing, the attack in the alley, me finding you, discovering our connection to David, maybe it wasn't random. Alexander picked up the family photo from David's letter. Maybe my brother is still looking out for both of us. As both men contemplated the impossible series of coincidences that had brought them together, they began to realize that their shared guilt over David's death might actually be the key to their healing. But healing would require more than just understanding the past. It would require building something meaningful from the ashes of their grief, something that would honor David's memory and give both of their lives new purpose. 2 weeks later, Alexander found himself in a place he'd never imagined, sitting on a bench in MacArthur Park, sharing a sandwich with Jimmy Crawford, while watching homeless veterans navigate another day of survival on the streets of Los Angeles. Jimmy had been discharged from the hospital 3 days earlier, and against every expectation of his board of directors, Alexander had extended his stay in L.A. indefinitely. His assistant Sarah had rented him a suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel, but Alexander spent most of his time in places like this, places where America's forgotten heroes struggled to find their next meal. See that guy over there? Jimmy pointed to a man in his 60s, wearing a faded Marine Corps jacket. That's Vietnam vet named Carlos, lost his leg in Da Nang, came home to a country that spit on him, been living rough for 40 years. Alexander watched Carlos carefully arrange his few possessions under a tree, maintaining military precision even in homelessness. How many are there, Jimmy? How many veterans are living like this? In L.A. County alone, probably 4,000 on any given night. Jimmy's voice was matter-of-fact, but Alexander could hear the pain underneath. Nationwide, we're talking about 40,000 veterans experiencing homelessness, and those are just the ones we can count. Alexander had been carrying around financial documents for 3 days, papers that his lawyers had drawn up based on conversations he'd been having with Jimmy about David's letter and its message about finding purpose beyond personal success. I want to show you something, Alexander said, pulling out a manila folder. Inside were legal documents establishing the David Hayes Foundation for Veteran Services, with an initial endowment of $50 million. Alexander had also included architectural plans for a residential facility that could house and provide services for 200 veterans. Jimmy stared at the papers, his eyes widening as he processed what he was seeing. Alex, this is incredible. But why are you showing me this? Because I want you to run it, Alexander said simply. Jimmy nearly dropped the documents. What? Jimmy, you understand these men and women in ways I never could. You know what they need, what they're going through, how the system has failed them." Alexander gestured toward Carlos and the other veterans scattered throughout the park. "I can provide the money, but you can provide something more valuable: understanding, credibility, hope. Alex, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm homeless myself. I have PTSD. I haven't held a steady job in 6 years. You held the most important job in the world for 8 years, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." Alexander's voice was firm, and you did it with honor, even when it cost you everything. Jimmy looked around the park, then back at the documents. "This facility you're planning, where would it be built?" "I've identified 3 potential sites, one in downtown LA, one in San Diego, and one here in the Mid-City area." Alexander pulled out additional papers showing property surveys and demographic studies. "But Jimmy, this isn't just about housing. David's letter talked about fighting for something bigger than yourself. I want to create something that gives veterans purpose, not just shelter." "What do you mean?" Alexander's eyes lit up with the same intensity that had built Nexus Technologies. "Vocational training, educational opportunities, mental health services, job placement programs. But more than that, I want to create a model that other cities can replicate. David died saving Rashid's family, but what if we could save thousands of families by helping their veteran parents get back on their feet?" Jimmy was quiet for several minutes, studying the plans. Alexander could see him thinking, calculating, envisioning possibilities. "The hardest part isn't the housing," Jimmy said finally. "It's the shame. Most of these guys feel like failures, like they let down their families, their country, themselves. They don't believe they deserve help." "Like you felt?" Alexander asked gently. "Exactly like I felt." Jimmy looked directly at Alexander. "Alex, what you're proposing here, it's not just a homeless shelter, it's a complete transformation program. That's the idea. David's letter said I needed someone who wouldn't be impressed by my money or success. Well, I need someone who will challenge me to use both in ways that actually matter." Jimmy stood up and walked a few steps away, looking out at the park where men and women who had served their country were now forgotten by it. When he turned back to Alexander, there were tears in his eyes. "You know what David would say about this?" "What?" "He'd say we're both idiots for talking about it instead of doing it." Jimmy smiled, the first genuine smile Alexander had seen from him. "When do we start?" Alexander pulled out his phone. "I can have the first property purchase agreement signed by tomorrow. Construction can begin within 60 days. "Alex, wait." Jimmy held up his hand. "If we're going to do this, we do it right. I want to survey every veteran in this area first. I want to know their stories, their needs, their dreams. This foundation shouldn't be built on what we think they need. It should be built on what they actually need." Alexander felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced since before David died, genuine excitement about building something meaningful. "You're talking about months of research before we even break ground," Alexander said. "I'm talking about doing justice to your brother's memory," Jimmy replied. "David didn't just rush into that compound to save Rashid's family. He spent weeks learning about their situation, understanding their needs, planning the right approach. If we're going to honor him, we do this the way he would have done it, thoroughly, thoughtfully, and with the people we're trying to help as true partners." Alexander extended his hand to Jimmy. "Partners?" Jimmy looked at Alexander's outstretched hand, then at the documents that would change both of their lives, then back at the veterans scattered throughout MacArthur Park. "Partners," Jimmy said, shaking Alexander's hand firmly. As they sat back down on the bench, both men realized that something fundamental had shifted. Alexander was no longer the isolated billionaire carrying the weight of the world alone. Jimmy was no longer the guilt-ridden veteran without purpose or direction. They had become something David Hayes had envisioned in his letter, 2 men fighting for something bigger than themselves, united by loss but motivated by hope. "There's one more thing," Alexander said, pulling a small box from his jacket pocket. Inside was David's bronze star medal, the one Jimmy had carried for 8 years. "Alex, that's yours." "No," Alexander said, closing Jimmy's fingers around the medal. "David earned this by choosing to be a hero. You've earned it by spending 8 years carrying his values even when you thought you'd lost everything else. Partners share the weight, remember?" As Jimmy held the bronze star, looking out at the veterans they were about to serve, both men understood that their transformation was just beginning. The real work, the work David would have been proud of, was about to start. 6 months later, the David Hayes Foundation had become more than either Alexander or Jimmy had imagined possible. The temporary facility in downtown L.A. was housing 87 veterans with a waiting list of over 300. Local news stations had covered their innovative approach, and cities from San Francisco to Miami were requesting consultation on replicating their model. But success came with unexpected challenges. Alexander stood in his office at the foundation, a modest space that was a far cry from his executive suite at Nexus Technologies, watching Jimmy through the window. His partner was in the courtyard, sitting with a young Marine named Marcus, who had returned from Iraq with severe PTSD and hadn't spoken to his family in 2 years. Jimmy had been spending 12-hour days at the facility, refusing to take time off, throwing himself into every veteran's story with an intensity that worried Alexander. Each success energized Jimmy, but each setback seemed to tear at old wounds that hadn't fully healed. "He's pushing too hard," said Dr. R. Alice Campbell, the Foundation's clinical director. She had joined them 3 months earlier from the VA system, frustrated by bureaucratic limitations on her ability to actually help veterans. "Jimmy's trying to save everyone personally, and it's burning him out." Alexander nodded, still watching Jimmy with Marcus. "He told me yesterday that he sees David in every veteran who comes through our doors. Every success feels like partial redemption for losing David. Every failure feels like losing David all over again. That's not sustainable, Alexander, and it's not healthy." Alexander knew Dr. Martinez was right, but he also understood something about Jimmy that she didn't. For the first time in 8 years, Jimmy Crawford had found purpose that matched the magnitude of his guilt. Taking that away from him might do more harm than good. "What do you suggest?" Alexander asked. "Force him to take a vacation. Or at least mandate regular counseling sessions." Alexander almost smiled. "Dr. Martinez, you've clearly never tried to give orders to a former Army squad leader. Jimmy Crawford doesn't take vacations. He takes missions." That evening, Alexander found Jimmy in the facility's common room, updating files on veteran placements. It was nearly midnight, and Jimmy looked exhausted. "Go home, Jimmy," Alexander said, sitting down across from him. "Marcus had a breakthrough today," Jimmy said without looking up. "He called his daughter. First time he's spoken to her in 3 years. She's getting married next month, and she wants him to walk her down the aisle." Alexander felt warmth in his chest. These moments, watching broken men and women reclaim their lives, had become the most rewarding part of his own transformation. "That's incredible," Alexander said, "but you still need to go home." Jimmy finally looked up, and Alexander was startled by what he saw. Jimmy's eyes held the same haunted expression they'd had in the hospital 6 months earlier. "What's wrong?" Alexander asked. Jimmy was quiet for a moment, then pulled out a newspaper clipping from his files. The headline read, "Local Veteran Takes Own Life After Struggling with Homelessness." "Thomas McKenna," Jimmy said quietly. "Vietnam vet, Bronze Star recipient, been on the streets for 15 years. He came to our intake meeting last month, but we didn't have space available. He was number 43 on our waiting list." Alexander felt his stomach drop. "Jimmy, he hung himself in an abandoned warehouse 3 days ago, Alex." "3 days?" Jimmy's voice was raw with pain. "If we'd had more space, if we'd moved faster on the second facility, if I'd found a way to help him immediately instead of putting him on a goddamn list. Stop. Alexander's voice was firm. Jimmy, you can't save everyone. Why not? Jimmy looked at Alexander with desperate eyes. Why can't I save everyone? We have the resources, we have the knowledge, we have the staff. The only thing limiting us is my inability to move fast enough, think clearly enough, be good enough. Alexander recognized the spiral Jimmy was falling into, the same perfectionist drive that had consumed Alexander's own life for years after David's death. Jimmy, listen to me. In 6 months, we've housed 87 veterans. We've reunited 14 men with their families. We've placed 31 people in permanent jobs. We've prevented dozens of suicides and overdoses. Alexander leaned forward. Thomas McKenna's death is a tragedy, but it's not your failure. Tell that to his daughter, Jimmy said bitterly. She called today, asking why the VA system failed her father. I had to explain that we're not the VA, that we're just one small foundation trying to fill gaps in a broken system. Alexander stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights of Los Angeles. Somewhere out there, hundreds of veterans were spending another night on the streets, and somewhere else, other veterans were sleeping safely because of the work he and Jimmy had built together. You know what I've learned in the past 6 months? Alexander said, turning back to Jimmy. I spent 8 years after David died trying to build a business empire that would prove I was worthy of being his brother. I made billions of dollars, but I was miserable because no amount of success could bring him back. Jimmy was listening now, his files forgotten. But working with you, building this foundation, seeing Marcus call his daughter, for the first time since David died, I feel like I'm honoring his memory instead of just hiding from his loss. Alexander sat back down. Jimmy, David's letter said I needed a friend who understood sacrifice. But I think he knew something else, that you needed a friend who understood the difference between perfection and purpose. What do you mean? I mean you can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to save anyone. Alexander picked up the newspaper clipping about Thomas McKenna. This man's death is heartbreaking, but it doesn't negate the 87 lives we've changed. David couldn't save everyone in Afghanistan, but that didn't make saving Rashid's family meaningless. Jimmy stared at the clipping, then at Alexander. How do you live with knowing you could do more, but being limited by time, resources, human capacity? By remembering that more is the enemy of enough, Alexander said, and by trusting that the work we're doing matters, even when we can't measure its full impact. For the first time in months, Jimmy smiled slightly. David used to say something similar. He'd say, "Don't let the perfect mission prevent the good mission." Smart man, my brother. Yeah, he was. Jimmy closed the files and stood up. Alex, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been thinking about since we started the foundation. What? Working here, seeing these veterans transform their lives. It's shown me something about myself that I'd forgotten. Jimmy looked directly at Alexander. I'm not broken. I'm wounded, but I'm not broken. There's a difference. Alexander felt tears forming in his eyes. What's the difference? Broken things can't be fixed. Wounded things can heal, especially when they have purpose and people who believe in them. Jimmy extended his hand to Alexander. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. As they shook hands, both men realized that the foundation had changed them as much as it had changed the veterans they served. They had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something meaningful from the lessons the past had taught them. But their journey wasn't over yet. The most powerful revelation was still waiting for them, hidden in the words David had written, but Jimmy had never fully processed. A revelation that would finally free them both from the chains of guilt they'd been carrying for 8 years. How? It was a rainy Thursday evening in November when Jimmy finally asked Alexander the question that had been haunting him for months. They were in Alexander's office at the foundation reviewing applications for their second facility in San Diego when Jimmy suddenly stopped writing and looked up. "Alex, can I ask you something about David's letter?" Alexander looked up from his laptop. "Of course. The part where David asks for my forgiveness, I've read it probably 100 times since that day in the hospital, but I'm not sure I really understand what he was asking forgiveness for." Alexander set down his laptop, giving Jimmy his full attention. "What do you mean?" Jimmy pulled out the letter, which he'd been carrying with him every day since they'd opened it. The pages were now worn soft from handling, and some of David's words had been traced over by Jimmy's finger countless times. "Listen to this part again," Jimmy said, finding the passage. "Jimmy, promise me 3 things. First, don't let my family blame themselves for my death. Second, don't you blame yourself either. This is my choice, made with full knowledge of the consequences. And third, find my brother Alexander. Tell him that his big brother's last act was exactly what he would have wanted it to be." "I remember," Alexander said. "But then there's this part at the very end, right before the postscript about the Bronze Star." Jimmy's voice became uncertain. David writes, "Jimmy, I need you to forgive me for asking you to carry a burden that was never yours to bear. I know that by asking you to watch over my family, I'm placing an impossible weight on your shoulders. Please forgive me for making you promise something that no one person should have to promise another." Alexander felt something shift in his understanding. "I never really focused on that part. I've been thinking about it for months, Alex. David wasn't just asking me to deliver a message to you. He was asking me to become, what, your guardian, your protector, your surrogate brother?" Jimmy's voice cracked. "How was I supposed to do that when I couldn't even protect him?" The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Alexander stared at Jimmy, finally understanding the full weight of what his brother had asked of this man. "Jesus, Jimmy, David asked you to replace him. Not replace him, but fill some kind of void he knew his death would leave in your life." Jimmy wiped his eyes. "For 8 years I've been carrying guilt about failing David, but I've also been carrying guilt about failing you. Even before I met you, I felt like I was letting down a promise I'd made to a dying friend." Alexander stood up and began pacing, his mind racing. "That's why you were living on the streets. It wasn't just survivor's guilt about David's death. It was the impossible burden of feeling responsible for a stranger's well-being. When David died, I lost my best friend. But I also gained an impossible obligation to someone I'd never met." Jimmy looked directly at Alexander. "How do you watch over someone's brother from 8,000 miles away? How do you protect someone who doesn't even know you exist? How do you fulfill a promise to care for a family when you're too broken to care for yourself?" Alexander felt a surge of anger, not at Jimmy, but at his brother. "David had no right to ask that of you, but he did ask it, Alex. And for 8 years, every time I've looked in a mirror, every time I've slept under a bridge or begged for food, I've heard David's voice asking me to take care of his little brother." Jimmy's voice became barely a whisper. "When those men attacked you in that alley and I saw you about to die, it felt like David giving me one last chance to keep my promise to him." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. "You didn't save me because I was a stranger in trouble. You saved me because you thought I was your responsibility. I saved you because David asked me to, 8 years ago." Jimmy looked at the letter again. "But Alex, that's what's been eating at me. David was asking forgiveness for giving me an impossible burden. He knew what he was asking was unfair, but he asked it anyway because he was dying and desperate to protect you." Alexander sat back down, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions he was feeling. Gratitude, anger, sadness, and something else, a deep understanding of how much his brother had loved him. "Jimmy, do you know what I think?" "What?" "I think David was wrong to ask that of you, but I also think he was terrified of leaving me alone." Alexander thought about his brother's last Christmas home, how David had worried about Alexander's isolation, his workaholic tendencies, his inability to form close relationships. David saw something in me that scared him, the potential for me to disappear into my work and forget how to live. He was right to be scared, Jimmy said softly. From what I've learned about your life before we met, you were disappearing. But Jimmy, here's what I think David didn't anticipate, that fulfilling his request would save you too. Alexander gestured around the office toward the foundation they'd built together. David asked you to watch over me, but what actually happened is that we ended up watching over each other. Jimmy stared at Alexander, processing this perspective. David asked you to carry an impossible burden, Alexander continued. But what if the burden wasn't impossible? What if it just required both of us working together instead of you trying to carry it alone? What do you mean? Alexander picked up a photo from his desk, a picture of him and Jimmy at the foundation's opening ceremony, surrounded by dozens of veterans whose lives they'd helped transform. Look at this photo, Jimmy. Do you see a man who failed to keep his promise to David? Jimmy studied the photo. I see two men who built something meaningful. You see two brothers, not by blood, but by choice. Alexander's voice was firm. Jimmy, you've been David's brother to me in ways I never could have imagined. You've challenged me, supported me, fought beside me, and helped me become someone David would be proud of. Tears were streaming down Jimmy's face now. Alex, David asked you to watch over his little brother. Mission accomplished, Sergeant Crawford. Alexander stood up and saluted Jimmy, a gesture that would have seemed ridiculous 6 months earlier, but now felt perfectly natural. But more than that, you gave David's little brother something he never asked for, but desperately needed. A friend who understands what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. Jimmy stood and returned the salute, both men laughing through their tears at the absurdity and perfect appropriateness of the moment. You know what this means? Jimmy said, wiping his eyes. What? It means David's letter wasn't asking me to carry an impossible burden. It was predicting an incredible friendship. Jimmy looked at the letter one more time, then carefully folded it and put it away. Alex, I forgive David for asking the impossible, and I forgive myself for thinking I had to do it alone. As the two men embraced, no longer bound by guilt, but united by purpose and genuine affection, they both realized that David Hayes had orchestrated something more sophisticated than either of them had understood. He hadn't asked Jimmy to replace him as Alexander's brother. He had asked Jimmy to become Alexander's brother in his own right, creating a bond that would heal them both. The final revelation wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about understanding that some promises are too big for one person to keep alone, but perfect for two people to keep together. David's greatest gift to both of them wasn't his letter. It was his faith that they would find each other and discover that the burden shared between true friends becomes not a weight, but wings. 1 year later, Alexander Hayes stood on the balcony of the third David Hayes Foundation facility, this one overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. The morning fog was just beginning to lift, revealing the city where he had once lived in isolation despite being surrounded by millions of people. Below him, in the courtyard of the facility, Jimmy Crawford was leading a group therapy session for recently transitioned veterans. Alexander could hear laughter, actual laughter, coming from men and women who had arrived broken and were now discovering that healing was possible. The San Francisco facility is officially at capacity, said Dr. Alice Campbell, joining Alexander on the balcony with 2 cups of coffee. 150 veterans housed, with a 93% success rate for permanent housing placement. Alexander accepted the coffee gratefully. And the waiting list? Down to 37 people, which is the lowest it's been since we opened. Alice smiled. The City Council approved funding for the 4th facility yesterday. We'll break ground next month. Alexander nodded, but his attention was drawn to something happening in the courtyard below. A young woman in her 20s had approached Jimmy's group carrying a toddler. One of the veterans, a man named Robert, who had been living under a freeway overpass, when they found him, stood up and embraced the woman. "That's Robert's daughter," Alice said, following Alexander's gaze. "She drove up from Los Angeles to introduce him to his granddaughter, first time they've spoken in 5 years. Alexander felt the familiar warmth in his chest that had become his daily companion since starting the foundation. These moments, watching families reunite, seeing broken people discover they weren't beyond repair, had become more valuable to him than any business deal he'd ever closed. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Emma, his daughter, now 13. "Dad, can't wait to see the new facility next week. I'm bringing my class presentation about the foundation to show you. Love you." Alexander smiled. Emma had become the foundation's youngest advocate, giving presentations at her school about veteran homelessness and organizing fundraising drives with her classmates. She had also developed a close relationship with Jimmy, who had become the uncle figure Alexander never realized she needed. "You know what's different about you?" Alice asked, studying Alexander's expression. "What?" "When I first met you a year ago, you looked like a man who was successfully running away from something. Now you look like a man who's successfully running toward something." Alexander laughed. "Jimmy says the same thing, but he puts it differently. He says I used to look like I was trying to earn the right to exist. Now I look like I know I already have that right. Jimmy's pretty wise for a guy who used to live under a bridge. Jimmy's pretty wise, period." Alexander looked back at his partner, who was now holding Robert's granddaughter while the group session continued around them. "Alice, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "When my brother David died, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me had already happened. I spent 8 years building walls around that pain, trying to make myself successful enough that grief couldn't touch me." Alexander paused. "But meeting Jimmy taught me that the worst thing wasn't David's death. The worst thing would have been letting David's death make me forget how to live." Alice was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "Now I wake up every morning knowing that David's death led to something he would be proud of. Not because his death was worth it, it wasn't, but because Jimmy and I chose to build something meaningful from our shared loss." The sound of Jimmy's laughter drifted up from the courtyard, and Alexander realized that this sound, the sound of his friend finding joy despite everything he'd lost, had become one of his favorite sounds in the world. "Mr. Hayes," Alice said formally, "permission to speak freely?" Alexander grinned. Alice had picked up military terminology from working with so many veterans. "Permission granted. You and Jimmy saved each other's lives in that alley, not just physically, emotionally, spiritually, completely. But more than that, you've created something that's going to save thousands of other lives. That's not just healing, that's transformation." Alexander thought about David's letter, which now hung framed in his office next to a photo of the first veteran family they'd successfully reunited. David had asked Jimmy to find Alexander because he thought his little brother needed a friend who understood sacrifice. But David had been only half right. They had both needed each other, Jimmy to remember that his life had value beyond his military service, Alexander to remember that success without purpose was just expensive emptiness. "Alice, I need to ask you something," Alexander said. "How many cities have requested consultation on replicating our model?" 47 last count. Why?" Alexander pulled out his phone and showed Alice an email that had arrived that morning. "The Department of Veterans Affairs wants to implement our model nationally. They're offering to fund foundation facilities in every major city in America." Alice's eyes widened. "Alexander, that's incredible. That's thousands of veterans you could help." "That's what Jimmy said when I showed him the email this morning?" Alexander looked back at the courtyard, where Jimmy was now teaching Robert's granddaughter to salute. But he also said something else. "What?" He said, "Alex, we built this foundation to honor David's memory." But I think David would want us to remember that the goal isn't to build the biggest foundation in the world. The goal is to make sure that eventually foundations like this aren't needed anymore. Alice nodded slowly. He's talking about systemic change. He's talking about a world where veterans don't fall through the cracks in the first place, where the transition from military to civilian life includes the support systems that prevent homelessness, addiction, and suicide. Alexander's voice became passionate. Jimmy and I can build facilities and change individual lives. But real change, David-level change, means fixing the system that creates these problems. That's a much bigger mission than running a foundation. It's exactly the kind of mission David would have chosen, Alexander said, the kind that seems impossible until someone decides to try anyway. Alexander's phone rang. It was Jimmy calling from the courtyard below. "Alex, you need to get down here." Jimmy's voice was excited. "Robert's daughter has something she wants to say to both of us." 5 minutes later, Alexander found himself standing in the courtyard with Jimmy, facing a young woman whose father had been transformed by their program. "Mr. Hayes, Mr. Crawford," she said, holding her toddler daughter, "I wanted to thank you both for giving me my father back. But more than that, I wanted to tell you that my daughter's middle name is going to be David, after the man whose memory inspired you to build this place." Alexander felt tears in his eyes as he looked at this little girl who would grow up knowing that her grandfather had been saved by people who believed in second chances. "Her name is going to be Sarah David Martinez," the woman continued, "and when she's old enough to understand, I'm going to tell her about two men who proved that the worst things that happen to us don't have to define us. They can transform us." I yawned as Alexander and Jimmy stood there, surrounded by veterans whose lives had been changed by their work. They both realized that David's letter had been prophetic in ways he never could have imagined. David had asked Jimmy to watch over his little brother, but what had actually happened was that two broken men had learned to watch over each other, and in doing so, had created something that would watch over thousands of others. The foundation wasn't just a memorial to David Hayes. It was proof that love transcends death, that friendship can heal impossible wounds, and that sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back. Alexander looked at Jimmy, his brother by choice, his partner in purpose, his living connection to David's values and dreams. "Ready to change the world, Sergeant Crawford?" Jimmy smiled and saluted. "Ready when you are, Mr. Hayes." As they walked back toward the building where their next mission was waiting, a phone call with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs about transforming military transition services nationwide, both men carried with them the knowledge that David Hayes was still bringing people together, still protecting the innocent, still fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Some stories end with death. But the best stories, the ones worth telling, begin with love that refuses to die, friendship that transcends tragedy, and purpose that transforms pain into hope. This was one of those stories. So what did you think of Alexander and Jimmy's story? Give the story a rating from 0 to 10. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next story.